Maybe on Facebook.
I thought Ian was joining us. He was very keen, wasn't he, on this subject?
Redirecting Facebook Live. That time it's doing it all over. We are live, boys and girls. Okay, hello, Facebook.
Is anybody there on Facebook?
What difference does it make?
Curiosity.
Huh?
Curiosity.
Kill the cat. And now you're going to say, I'm a victim. The rabbi called me a cat.
Absolutely right.
That time you stood tall and proud. Oh, sorry.
There you go. Now I am a victim.
Now, you see, you're getting having a go at Ralph again.
Okie dokie. Having said all of that, and with the absence of our resident Islamic expert and championer of Islamic rights, we look like we might have a free run today. We are doing the century, the 7th century from 6 to 700, which of course sees the rise of Islam, although Muhammad was born already in 580, 586, somewhere around there. So we will be touching on that. But let's do a little bit of backtracking and put things into context. And at the end of the day, the share is on Jewish history, not on Muslim history. So number one, the period of time from a Jewish perspective that we're speaking about are the period of the Gaonim. Now, even the name itself, Gaonim, is open for debate as to where it comes from. Most probably, according to many, each leader was called the Rosh Hashiva of the Gaon Yaakov of this one. Gaon means the splendor of Yaakov, taken from Tehillim, and then it may have been reduced to just being the Gaon. Another important fact to remember at this point is during the time of the Tannaim, we have only got the names of the leaders of the community, not of their students. Like we have Beis Hillel, in the time of the Amoraim, we are given the names of hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of all of the scholars. When we get to the Gaonim, we are once again told the names of the Gaon. There are 90 in total, 50 in one yeshiva, 40 in the other. Here comes Jonathan. And we've got 90 Gaonim, but we're not told the names of all of their hundreds of students, even though we do have an account of what the yeshiva looked like with the rows upon rows upon rows of Talmudical students sitting there. But they're all known, the period is known as the period of the Gaonim after the one teacher. Most probably because of what we'll see later on about having a central authority. But this begins in the year 589. The Talmud itself was closed in 500. We have 89 years of the Savoiraim, who are the editors. And we learned at the previous year as to how much or how little they may have done with the editing of the Talmud. And now it is closed. It's a closed book. And in order for a closed book to work, you need to have vibrant centers of teachers, because otherwise all you've got is a cold book behind us. I'm pointing behind us as the library. You can have all of those books, but unless you've got people learning them, it makes no difference. You may as well just have a virtual background or a wallpaper that looks like books. What did the rabbis of the time of the Gaonim do? I've mentioned already that there was a lot of anonymity amongst the rabbis, but also we have, for the first time, succession father to son. In the times of the Gemara, we only know of one Amora stepping up into the place and taking over his father's authority. That's Mar, the son of Rav Ashi. And even then, was a very specific set of circumstances as to why he would have taken over. In the times of the Gaonic period, very often the son would take over his father's position. And I mentioned that there was a description we have of the yeshiva, and it describes everybody sitting in rows, and the first 7 rows was the important ones. And if you were the son of the incumbent, when he passed away and you had the ability, it was natural that you would move forward and you would end up being the number one. You would be the Gaon, the Reish Yeshiva at that time. And so we have, over the next 500 years, an acceptance, a concept of Jewish aristocracy, and it is not based at all on land ownership. And as we will see, in fact, during this time, Jewish land ownership goes out of the norm. Less and less Jews own land, mainly because they had to pay an extra tax for it, and it wasn't worth their while. It wasn't financially worthwhile, so they don't become landowners. They are traders, importers, etc. But the aristocracy is not on land ownership, but rather on Torah knowledge, and you had to have the character and scholarship to fill your father's shoes, to have a blanket check that you're going to give to the son. You just have autocracy. You don't have the fact that every person is fitting for it. So the aristocracy went father to son, although you of course didn't need to have the learning to go there. We've mentioned beforehand the Reish Galusa. The Reish Galusa is the descendants from the house of David. In last year, we learned of Mar Zutra. Mar Zutra was murdered by the Persian authorities in Israel at that time. The Persians and the Byzantines are arguing and fighting with one another the whole way through. In fact, before the Muslims came to Jerusalem, there'd been a continuous 30-year war between the Persians and the Byzantines in Jerusalem, in Israel, and the Jews had suffered terribly. But back halfway through the previous century, in about the year 550, Mar Zutra is murdered. His child actually has to be squirreled away, and is taken to Tiberias. And we have from then until around the year 620, when Islam is starting to come along. Bear in mind, the beginning of the calendar from the Muslims' perspective, Muhammad rises to power in 613. The first year of their calendar is 622. In 620, or possibly 637, you have the story of Bustanai. Has anybody heard of the Reish Galusa, the exile ark called Bustanai? No?
No.
Oh, I'm getting a big smile. I'm going to tell you, growing up, both of my kids, it was Rabbi Lehman, Marcus Lehman, one of his, you have heard of the Jewish author Marcus Lehman? Yeah. Have you read any of his books? These were ones that I was brought up with. My father gave them to me, old-fashioned writing. But I suppose if I was quoting Isaac Bashevis Singer, you all know what I'm talking about. You didn't read Isaac Bashevis Singer?
Yes.
Yes, yes.
Okay. You know, I don't feel so bad now.
Marcus Lehman?
Marcus Lehman was another author. He's written a number of. When did he live? Yeah, Tzivia, go run on. According to Tzivia, 1800s in Germany. Who knows? Maybe it may be the 1900s. Anyway, he writes the story of Bustanai. Although the first time we have the story of Bustanai is not until the 1700s, when we have a book written, Seder Hadoros by Rabbi Yechiel Halperin. He was a rabbi of Minsk, which at that point was in Russia, and he tells this fantastical story about a man by the name of Bustanai. At that point, you've got Mainz, Germany from 1831 till 1890. Mainz. Rabbi Dr. Marcus Lehman. So yeah, and one of them he writes is that of Bustanai, Rabbi Yosman. Some very, very good books written by him.
How do you spell the name?
Marcus, Marcus,
Yeah.
Lehman, Lehman. Marcus Lehman.
Did you say Naaman or Lehman?
Lehman, Lehman. Old schooled, old fashioned, German scholar, writes a number of novels as well, based on historical facts. But it's written, and those were the only Jewish novels we had when we were growing up as kids. They were the only ones that were there. And so earlier, not long before Rabbi Lehman, you've got in the 17th century a book written, Seder HaDoros, which was the first real Jewish history book after the time of the Gaonim. And he writes a lot about Bustani, and he tells a story of the times of the king of Persia. The king killed all of the descendants of the house of David. Now, we've only got one corroborating fact, that is the murder of Mar Zutra in the middle of the 6th century. And now we're sort of like 90 years later on, in which case some things are going to struggle to fit into place. But the king killed all of them. And he ordered, anyone to be found was literally to be murdered, thrown into prison. They had to have non-kosher food poured on top of them so that they would stink. One day he has a dream, and the king is walking through a garden, and everything, all the trees in the garden are beautiful and luscious, and he cuts them all down. He chops all of the trees down until eventually he decides, yeah, they're all gone, but he wants to just check, and he goes and he finds one little shoot coming up from the ground, picks up an axe to chop this one down, and a man with a ruddy complexion stands in front of him, and he tells him, make sure you stop. What are you doing? And he says, what are you talking about? I've not done anything wrong. The old man takes the axe from the king's hand, smashes it on his head, and the king falls down. And the king says, what have I done? I've not done anything. He says, you've not done anything? You destroyed my entire garden. And if you wanted them, come in, have some fruit. If you wanted a tree, take a sapling, plant it in your own garden. And he gives them a mapola, yelling at. He goes, so what should I do? He says, you better make sure that you look after this. Anyway, the king, there's only one answer, and that is to remove you from the land of the living. He says, the only way to atone for himself is to look after this one shoot. King wakes up, doesn't know what to do. He's petrified. He's got blood pouring down his face. So the dream came into reality. He asks his advisors, what do I do? They say to him, we don't know. Go ask the Jews. There's a tradition that the Jews know how to interpret dreams well. So he goes along. They find, the few Jews that are living around, they're all in the dungeons. And one old man says, hey, I'll go to the king. The Jews say to him, why are you doing that? He says, not only do I know how to interpret his dream, I know what his dream was because I had the exact same dream last night. So the king says, well, you've got to come along. The advisors say, you better get dressed. You stink. He says, I'm going to the king as I am. He put me in this situation, that's how I'm going to him. He goes along and he meets the king, and he says, and the king says, can you interpret? He says, not only will I interpret, I'll tell you a dream. And he tells the king his dream, exactly how it was. And he says, who was the old man? That was David HaMelech, that was King David. You made sure to destroy and to kill all of his descendants. He goes, what about the one shoot? He says, I don't know, just before you threw me into the dungeon, my daughter got married to a descendant of the house of David. And the week after the wedding, you killed him, and I got thrown into prison. Who knows? Maybe she's be pregnant. I've got no idea. So the king, they send him off, find the daughter, Taka, she's pregnant. She gets brought into the king's palace, gets totally looked after, and she gives birth to a son who they call Bustanai, because the word Bustan is Persian for a fruit garden. And Bustanai grows up and is quite a scholar. And one day he gets stood in front of the king. The next part of the story is the only bit that we've got corroboration for from elsewhere. When he's standing in front of the king, and a fly goes on his forehead and he stings him until blood comes out from a bite, whatever it might be. And the king said, why didn't you drive the insect away? And Bustanai said, we have a tradition in our household, when you stand in front of the king, you do not move without permission. When the king sees this, and he starts up the position of Reish Galusa again. That's the story as it's told in Seder HaDoros. I've shortened it for the sake of the share. As I say, the Rav Shiri Ragon says that he descended from King David, but not from Bustanai. So there must have been more than one branch of the family. So we know that Bustanai is not the only one who have survived. But we do have later on, when there's an argument between two Roshei Galusa, two heads of the assembly, who should be in charge, they both stand in front of the king. One of them is called Bustanai, one of them is not. A fly comes along and bites Bustanai, and he doesn't move. And this is recorded in external sources. And the king goes, why not? He says, tradition from my ancestors' house of King David. He goes, you're the true one. So that's the bit that is corroborated elsewhere. The previous part of the story, Cain and Vaisish, I don't know, but we have the position of Reish Galusa started again in around about the year 635, 637, around then it is started. But importantly, during the period between Malzutri in 550 and Bustanai in 630, there is no civil authority amongst the Jews. All of the authority comes along from the Gaonim. They are the ones that have total authority over everyone, and you better listen to them. So the position of legal authority amongst the Jewish people is from the yeshiva, from the Gaonim, from the rabbinical court. The Reish Galusa was a civil authority collected. Now, all that power has been put on to the Rosh Yeshiva, and when Bustanai is put into place, and from that point onwards, whenever the Muslims put a Reish Galusa in place, it has to be under the agreement of the heads of the yeshiva. And so we will have for the next 500 years, well, 400 or so years, from the middle of the 7th century up until the 11th century, when the time of the Gaonim finished, that even when there is a Reish Galusa, he is subservient or second down in the pecking order to the Gaon. So the religious head of the town is also the legal head of the town. They have the possibility to put someone in cherem, in excommunication, and they use it to damning effect. I mean, it really works. If you've got somebody that's refusing to give his wife a get, creating his wife an aguna, put them in cherem. Now, I remember a number of years ago, there was a kosher restaurant in London. The guy was refusing to give his wife a get, so the kashrus authority removed his hechsher. So he went to another one. He got a hechsher from another kashrus authority. They declared cherem, so half the people, is it? This one's in cherem? Right, we're definitely going to go there. In the times of the Gaonim, if you put in cherem, you could not do business with anyone. People had to cross over the side of the road. You couldn't join. You couldn't be part of it. You couldn't make up the minyan. If you were in shul with the 9 other men, there was no minyan. You know, I previously had in another shul where at one point, so not only would they not give an aliyah to somebody who's married out, but there were some kanoim, some zealots, who wouldn't even count them as a minyan. And we had one morning, it was during Salichas before Rosh Hashanah. And it was early morning. It's an older community, not many young men. And the minyan is struggling at 6:30 in the morning. And we found 10 men. And so, no, there's no minyan. I'm like, there's 10 of us. Oh, no, Rabbi, there's no minyan. I'm like, I can count, there's 10 of us. Psst, he's married out. I'm like, so? No, we don't. I said, he's here. We're saying Kaddish. We'll continue on. If you want to call for somebody else as well, I will walk out and you won't have a minyan. So I said, fine. If you walk out and don't have a minyan, you can't walk back in again. Ever. If you walk out now and break this minyan because of your sensitivities that this guy's married out, then sorry, you can't make the minyan anymore. He backed down. We had the minyan, but we did come to a compromise that we would always try to get an 11th man. However, if by the time it came to Rabbi Yishmael and we only had 10, including this gentleman, we weren't going to deny somebody saying Kaddish just because of another person's sensitivities. But in the times of the Gaonim, you put into cherem, that cherem worked and and everybody followed by that one rule. Alan, yes.
I just see Jeffrey smiling because he will no doubt remember, as I do, we had a similar incident in Southport many, many years ago, where somebody who married out was told, "I'm sorry, you don't count towards a minion." I just saw the look on Jeffrey's face, and I couldn't resist mentioning.
I saw the look on your face as well.
Yes.
I think we were both there.
Yes. Is anyone problem with this? Halachically, it's got no. It doesn't have any.
I know that now.
And not only that, not giving someone an aliyah because of marriage out is also okay. You don't have to give them a privilege. You don't give them shlishi on Yom Kippur. But if they've got a chiyuv, their rights are not restricted unless the kehillah makes that rule. So if you've got the entire town, so let's say Gate of can have where everyone does the same thing. We'll see later on about paying their paying the Jewish tax to head up. In Gateshead, I think it still happens. Everybody has got to pay the butcher's tax. Everybody pays part of a tax every year to subsidize the butchers, to subsidize the shechita. And if you don't do it, you can't be part of the community. But to deny someone that, what is the community like? So if the community won't give to anybody, if you drive to shul, if you eat treif, or if you're married out, none of it, we're from communities, Zozain Azoid. But if you're not, then to start to differentiate between one and the other, not for today's share, but it doesn't fit in with halacha. Yeah. Even though I have defended a shul's right to do so, that was that shul's right to do it. I just don't, I think halachically, it's very, very questionable as to stop them from doing that. Anyway, when the Gaonim, often Rav Shrira calls them as a malach, as in a monarch, their authority over everyone there. We've mentioned about the anonymity of the others. We know of the 90 or so Gaonim who went along between the two. The anonymity of the others means that the one person in charge really was in charge, and he was able to send out halachic responser, thousands of which we have and have been printed up and are also indexed in order to know what they are. Many thousands more have been lost, but oftentimes they would write, in the following nusach: so and so, son of so and so, head of the yeshiva of Surah or Pumbedisa. Even when the yeshivas moved, they still were called Surah and Pumbedisa. So they may have moved to other areas, but they maintained that thing. To all the learned men and students who live elsewhere, be in peace. Receive my good wishes. Those of the Dayan, the head of the Kahal, the learned men who represent the Sanhedrin, the minor Sanhedrin, everything. And this is my ruling. After they wrote the halachic ruling, they would often also write, from this date onwards, from this decision, you're not allowed to deviate left or right. This command is immovable. This is where it should be done. And so the Gaonim wrote that. Now this continued on until European Jewry grew back again. It had already been there earlier, but it grew back again in the 11th century, which we'll get to in a couple of weeks' time. Just before, seems to have come in on perfect timing. Just before we do go on to the rise of Islam, we've mentioned about the full yeshiva, but there are two other aspects that I just want to look at before we get onto Islam as to what within the community organizations. One of them, which I've already briefly touched on, is that of the Kehillah. And now there was a congregant I had in Newcastle, came from Germany, since moved to Eretz Yisrael, always spoke about the Kehillah. The Kehillah does not mean the congregation. The Kehillah is the authoritative body within the community, and they would have to collect taxes, the taxes of the non-Jewish authorities, which had to be sent along. As I said, a lot of this was done because of land ownership. The Gemara already tells us that land ownership had reduced amongst Jews because of the unfair tax burden, but instead became very much a trade going there and back. But they had to collect the taxes for the government, and they also had to give the taxes for the Jewish authorities. This obligation to collect the taxes for the non-Jewish authorities carries on into Europe, and we have it a lot in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. The Vad Arba Harotzis, the Council of the Four Lands, who collect the taxes to give along. The Germans, the Nazis, Yimach Shemon, used it to devastating effect when they set up the authorities within the ghettos, that there would be one person, he would be responsible, except the taxes that they were collecting were living people in order to then take off out to the forests of Polonrai. But the authority and the responsibility of the Kehillah was done on those, but he also had positive ones, which was to make sure that the poor were properly looked after, that there would be benevolent and charitable organizations. The mikvahs were kept, the roads, everything was done. Basically, everything that we expect the local council to do now was done by the Kehillah and was set up and carried on going along, and they took it with them from Babylon, from the Middle East, and they brought it to Europe when we have Reb Ger Shemer Hagola setting up in the 10th century in Europe, and then following on by Rashi. They maintain the same thing, that you've got a responsibility of the community. The next thing you have is the actual Beis Din. The Beis Din, these three authorities, you have the Reish Galusa, the head of the yeshiva of Surah, and the head of the yeshiva of Pumbedisa. That gave the Reish Galusa some authority. He was slightly on par with the head of the yeshiva, but he didn't give a halachic ruling because he could have been outvoted by the two heads of the yeshivas, and they would appoint a dayan. The dayan would be appointed in each and every city individually, and they would be paid by a tax on the community. That tax was 2 zuz every year from every adult male over the age of 20. So you got the Chad Gadya that my father bought Bitrei Zuzin for 2 zuz. Some say this is the allusion to what was the goat your father bought for 2 zuz. It was your local dayan. You bought him. And a dayan who can be bought, what is he at the end of the day? He's nothing more than a goat. And all he's going to do is set up a chain of events of being bitten by a cat, attacked by a dog, hit by water, hit by a stick, etc., until eventually along comes the Almighty. He's going to exact his judgment from you for doing this. So if you think you could buy him, you paid your 2 zuz. You haven't bought him. And one of the pet peeves that many rabbis have is when you in every community you've got one of them. Someone says, "I pay your wages." You don't pay them. In much the same way, you don't turn around to a policeman and tell him that you pay his wages. Not unless you want to get your collar felt. You don't pay the policeman's wages. You pay your tax. From that goes along here. You don't pay the Rav's wages either. You pay your shul fees, and part of what you receive in return is a Rav, a Chazan, a caretaker, and everybody else along there. But you would receive your income from the community, but the community couldn't appoint or dismiss him. That would be the authority of the Reish Galusa and the head of the 2 yeshivas. Jewish life continues in Babylon, everything all right. But in Israel, here is where we have the problems, and this is where Islam, to give the game away, does definitely save Judaism. There's no 2 ways about it. The rise of Islam saved Judaism, but would it have happened another way? Yeah, it could have happened another way. The Almighty wants us to be saved. We will be saved. So a second. Just because I mentioned the secretary doesn't mean that she needs to come. When Rome falls, Europe enters into the Dark Ages, whether or not it starts as early as 476, whether it doesn't start its Dark Ages until 632. When Islam comes along, who knows? But Europe enters into a Dark Ages. the rulers of Eretz Yisrael have, for the last 100 or so years, been divided up between the Persians and the Byzantinians. The Greek Empire, the Roman Empire, we already learned in the last year, divided up into two. You had East, West. The Western Roman Empire falls with the sack of Rome in the 5th century. The Greek Orthodox, the Eastern Roman Empire, based out of Constantinople, is terribly anti-Semitic and tries to get Jews out of Eretz Yisrael in any which way they could do, either through paying them to emigrate, forcing them to convert. At one point, you've got the Sasanian dynasty comes along, and you've got the Gubas, which are the fire-worshipping pagans that are along there. Be that as it may, by the time you come to the the first quarter of the 7th century, life in Eretz Yisrael for Jews is terrible. What though happens is you've got the rise of Muhammad, the rise of Islam. Now, already 3 centuries earlier, Rav Oshia said that the survival of the Jewish people depends on the fact that they're going to always be 2 contending empires. If you've got all the Jews in one place at one time, they're under the mercy of one authority. The Byzantine Empire was winning. It was slowly but surely overcoming the Persians. Had they finally won the battles in 620 and 630 against the Persians, then they would have had total authority of everywhere where Jews were or were known to be at that time. With Islam coming along, they come along to save us. Had they conquered Persia, then they would have also defeated the Western Roman Empire. That means Jews in Europe, who'd been there already since the time of the first Beis Hamikdash, since the time of the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash, Jews in Babylon, who had been there from the times of the first Beis Hamikdash, Israel, Egypt, Syria, that entire area, the Fertile Crescent, would have been under one authority, and they were fanatically hostile to the Jews. They saw any which way that they could persecute the Jews. Even though we might sometimes look at the Western Roman Empire as being more of a problem, mainly because they were in charge in Europe, and that's where you've got the problems with the Crusaders, the Cossacks, the Nazis. Those all come from Western Roman Empire. But the Western Church, however, 1,000+ years ago, the real problem was actually the Eastern Roman Empire, the Greek Orthodox Church. They were worse to us than the Western ones were. However, along comes Muhammad. Now, until this point, you've got all of the nomadic tribes. They are called Aravim because they come along from the Arab. They come along from the West. Many of them may have claimed descent from Yishmael, hence also from Abraham, and then they often saw companionship amongst the Jews. The individual tribes, they were nomads, they were illiterate, they lived off the land. If they wanted any connection with officialdom, they would speak to the Jews. We shared a language. The Aramaic language, even with the different dialects, meant that we could converse one with the other. Yes, they were troublesome. We have years earlier, let's make sure we get the right one, when they came along, we have in the book of Judges, and it came to pass when Israel had sown their crops that Midian and Amalek Midian and Amalek and the sons of the east, the Arabic tribes, came up against them, encamped against them, destroyed produce of the land as far as Gaza. They left no sustenance for Israel, neither sheep, nor ox, or donkey, for they came up with their cattle and their tents. They came like locusts in the multitude, for both they and their camels were without number. They entered the land to judge it, to destroy it. That's from the book of Judges, i.e. before the time of David HaMelech. There's always been nomadic tribes that come along. However, what does Muhammad do? Muhammad comes along and says, can we have everybody joining in together? He doesn't like the pagan religions that are out there. There'd been contact, A, with Christianity, and B, a lot with Jews. And they're seeing the pagan authorities as really being terrible. And in fact, so much so, one of the pagan masters of Persia said, how do you get rid of stealing? There's no such thing as private ownership anymore. How do you get rid of adultery? There's no such thing as marriage. There's no such thing as marriage. You can't have adultery. If you can't own something, it can't be stolen from you. How do you get rid of murder? There's no longer autonomy over your own life. What have I done? I'm not murdered. What have I taken from you? The best way to get rid of the sin is to remove any rights whatsoever. Therefore, anybody can do whatever they want. And there was a period of time at the very beginning of the 7th century when that was the law of the land. Muhammad doesn't like that. He is illiterate. He can't really write himself, and he gets the Quran written by other people. He comes along in the year 613. It's an easy date to remember because there's 613 mitzvahs. Muhammad comes along and he declares himself as a prophet. From that time until now, we've got probably in the world, is there 1 billion Muslims? Started off by one man. And he stresses over and over that there is one God, which put him at odds with the only other authority there, which was the Christians, because they had the Holy Trinity. And his declaration of the faith of one God was mainly in order to say how Islam was the correct and the true successor to Judaism and not Christianity. Both Islam and Christianity tie their roots in to Judaism, because if you want to give something new, you've got to have a grain, an element of truth in it. In order for Islam to say, we are not like the Christians, we are the true successors, and Muhammad focused in on monotheism, and he establishes 5 laws. 1, to believe in the one Hashem and to pray to Muhammad as his prophet, to pay 5 times a day towards Mecca, although originally it was towards Jerusalem, to give tzedakah, to observe the fast of the month of Ramadan, which was meant to correspond with Yom Kippur, and the 5 fast days were also the 5 tefillahs that we have on Yom Kippur, and to make an annual pilgrimage to Mecca. Later on, the jihad, holy war, was added as a 6th real canonical obligation. And Muhammad, when he begins off, he wants to be part and parcel of Judaism. He sees a kindred spirit there. But they really didn't, the Jews didn't need this illiterate, nomadic farmer, sheep farmer, what he was, camel driver, to tell them what to do. Muhammad turns against us. He turns around the direction of prayer from Jerusalem to Mecca. There's a great big black stone there, which he says, put there by the angel Gabriel. He rejects the Jewish calendar and goes entirely lunar-based, which means that's why they lose 11 days of the year. In the same way that Christianity had changed the day of rest from Saturday, Shabbos, to Sunday, he changes it from Shabbos through to Friday, but keeps a number of similarities. Why on earth would they not, would everything have to be shechted? Did the Arabs ritually shecht their animals beforehand? No, but he's trying to give a solid base to what's going on. However, by doing this, he diverted attention away from the Byzantine Empire, and he stops their spread across into the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East, and does the opposite, turns around and goes back into Israel. The reason why they did that is because of the law that an Arab is not allowed to attack another Arab. Let's leave aside for the moment the major fights between the Shiites and the Sunnis that takes place after Muhammad dies, and when one group, one faction chooses his father-in-law, the other one chooses his son-in-law, and then we have the beginning of the Shiites, their leader Hussein gets killed, and they set up a new division within Islam. But to begin with, you're not allowed to attack anybody that declared their faith in the one God and Muhammad, which seriously impacted the way of their nomadic lifestyle. At that point, if ever one tribe had, through famine, through an attack by vultures or whatever it might, disease, had lost their cattle, what do? You go along to the neighboring tribe, you attack them, to the victor goes the spoils, and that's how it, and it worked across that entire area. It worked fine. But once anybody has declared that they're part of the tribe of Islam, which literally means submission, you can't attack them anymore. So they look their way to go further west, and they move slowly but surely into Eretz Yisrael, and they attack everyone there. Now, until that time, whenever a tribe had come along attacking them, the local authorities had knocked them back. All of a sudden, they come along with proper training. They are bound together by something that was a little bit more, and the world wasn't expecting it. Neither the Persians nor the Byzantinians were expecting a group of people to be this strong, this organized. And within a very short time, they have overtaken the whole area. And when they come into Israel, they find a warring tribes. The Jews and the Christians are arguing with one another. Now, there is a big argument amongst historians. When the Jews were kicked out of Jerusalem after the destruction of the Second Temple and the second revolt by Bar Kokhba in 130, were there any Jews left behind at all? And the answer is there were a couple. Jerusalem itself may have been Judenrein, but there definitely were Jews in the rest of Israel. But they are very much second-class citizens, and as we've heard a lot, they are persecuted, they're forced to convert. And their main persecutors are the Christians. Now along comes Islam, and they start to say, well, who else is allowed to be here? Just before we get to them, Muhammad passes away on the 7th of June. We are now the 9th of June. So had we given this year 2 days ago, it would have been, according to the Gregorian calendar, it would have been Muhammad's Yortzeit. He passes away on the 7th of June, 632. So he's only around for 9 years after he comes to authority. But this everyone is now already believers, and they need somebody to fill the vacuum. You've got either Abu Bakr, who is his father-in-law, is a father of one of Muhammad's favorite wives, and he chooses everyone together. The other one is Ali, who is Muhammad's son-in-law, and that begins your problems between the Shiites and the Sunnis in a very small nutshell. We shouldn't really distill it down to that argument, but this is where it goes on. But they are very, very successful in continuing all of this. And he calls himself, interesting, Khalifat Rasul Ilah, successor to the apostle of God. And the word Khalifat, successor, is where the word caliphate comes from. They are always a successor, and it's very important for them that you have this word caliphate, that they are the successors to the ones previously. There is lots of arguing there and back between them, and there are that many murders, assassinations going through that many of the leaders come and go. However, rule of the law, they allow each local authority, because what they found embarrassing is that whilst it's easy to spread and to conquer, they've never had any experience in day-to-day running of the lands that they conquered. They were a nomadic tribe. Nobody knows anything about paying taxes, maintaining roads, making sure that there's public amenities. None of that is within their way of life at all. Who is very good at doing it? The Jews had been very good at running their own communities, and they allowed it to happen. And they allowed the Jews to continue looking after everything. There is an interesting paragraph down here. The Arab writer Ibn Lahai died in the year 759, so later on than we are. He quotes something that took place previously. He says, he quotes, he says, I once met the Reish Galusa, Ras al Galut, Reish Galusa, who said to me, the Reish Galusa said to Abul Aswad, he says, between me and King David, there are 70 generations, yet the Jews treat me with utmost respect and knowledge, acknowledge my prerogatives, and feel duty bound to protect me. Between you and Muhammad, there's one generation, yet you've already murdered his grandson. Islam spread as by the sword. If you go to Istanbul, I've been there, you can see the sword of Muhammad. They really conquered everything nobody was expecting it. There'd been wars in Eretz Yisrael from 610 till 640, 3 different wars, gone there and back, there and back. And every time the Jews were blamed for it. When the Muslims come along and they rule, that's it. This is it. And everyone's going to behave themselves. The Jews ask for permission to go into Jerusalem. They want to actually settle in Jerusalem. And they are told, you know what? If you can come to an agreement with the Christians there. Now, the problem is that the Christians didn't really want to allow the Jews in. And the Muslims said, unless you come to an agreement, we'll sort it out ourselves. And they were worried that, hey, they're not going to be allowed. The Jews go to them with a request for 200 families. The Christians say 50. We managed to get it up to 70. And from that point on, 70 Jewish families were allowed to live in Jerusalem. Now, I'm just going to fast forward a little bit. But in order to do so, we've got to backtrack. After the death of King Solomon, Shlomo HaMelech, what happens? Hello? After the death of King Solomon?
Divided kingdom.
Thank you very much. There's a divided kingdom. You've got the kingdom of Judah in the south and the kingdom of Israel in the north. You've got Jeroboam, the son of Nevat, who rules the kingdom in the north. In order to stop the Jews from going down to the Beis HaMikdash, those that are living in the north, he built places of idol worship in Dan. He said, because if they go down to Jerusalem, they're going to see Rehoboam, son of Solomon, sitting in the Beis HaMikdash. That will prove his legitimacy. So he doesn't want them doing that. And so he sets up places of idol worship in the north. In an echo of that, 1,500 or so years later, the Muslims do the same thing. In order to discourage Muslim pilgrims from going along to Mecca, where the Umayyad caliphs were, the caliphate here said that now you're going to have a holy city of Jerusalem. Now, later generations, that caused a lot of trouble. If you think about it now, that causes a lot of trouble for us. Back then, it was brilliant for the Jews of Jerusalem. They are at the forefront of the caliph's concern. Throughout the history of the Umayyad dynasty, Eretz Yisrael was governed by a close friend of the caliph, and Jerusalem had its position of authority. It was very, very good for the Jews to now be declared, hey, everything's all right. But there is still one more piece of the puzzle to put together. Islam saved Judaism, no doubt about it. Could it have been chosen by somebody else? Yes. Had Islam not come along, the Byzantines would have defeated the Persians. They would then have been able to go along and defeat the Western Roman Church, and everything would have been under one authority. The Muslims come along instead and stop them, divide and conquer, and give rights to the Jews, allow them to go back into Eretz Yisrael to rebuild up, establish Jerusalem once more as a holy city, and we stay there. In the 16th century, the walls get built around Jerusalem by Solomon the Magnificent. The walls that we know around Jerusalem now are built by a Muslim. Of course, the Dome of the Rock, of course, was actually a church beforehand. After Titus destroyed the Beit HaMikdash, the next thing built there was a church then the Muslims during this time changed it into a mosque. But there's one more small piece of the puzzle, and that is the Sefer Torah. The Sefer Torah that we have now is based on a Sefer Torah that was written back then. Back in the year 520, we spoke about Mazutra having been murdered by the Persians. His young son has to be spirited outside of Israel, gets taken along to Tiberia. He is brought up in Tiberias, and they have a little small group of Jews in Tiberias. Babylonia develops with the Gemara, and they are the masters of halacha. But when it comes to the text of the scriptures, they always deferred to Eretz Yisrael, and they would always copy. There was this original copy, the Chumash was written down from there, and Rambam, Maimonides, sets out how the Sefer Torah should be written, and he says the Torah scroll upon which we have relied for these rules is a well-known scroll to be found in Egypt. It includes the 24 books, which is the whole of Tanakh, that have been in Jerusalem for many years, so that the scrolls can be checked against it, and upon which everyone placed reliance, since it's been corrected by Ben Asher, who worked on its exactitude for many years, corrected it many times while he copied it, and now relied on that scroll. Our Sefer Torah that we have now have got to go the whole way back. Now, interestingly enough, in Prague, at the time of the Maharan of Prague, there was a Sefer Torah there that they claim was actually written by Ezra, which obviously takes us back to the destruction of the first temple. Ezra HaSofer, Ezra the scribe, who writes it when they go back to Israel at the building of the second Beis HaMikdash. Here we are nearly 1,000 years later, when, because of the stability being given once again in Eretz Yisrael, they take on that responsibility to make sure that all of the letters are correct. Now, interestingly enough, at this point, there are no vowels in a Sefer Torah. There are no vowels in the Hebrew language. They're not. Two different vowel systems are set up, one in Babylon, one in Israel, and the one in Israel is accepted, including the cantillation marks, the Tameh HaMikra that we use in order to lane. Those are kept from the Eretz Yisrael tradition. The Septuagint, for example, which is the Greek translation of the Sefer Torah, done by the 70 rabbis. Now, I had a history professor who says that there were two. There was the one that was done in the times of the Beis HaMikdash, which we accept. There was another one that was done years later on by Roman authorities, which is Treif. According to the one over here, it seems that actually there was only one of them. And the original one, which was done in order to popularize Greek culture, has the opposite effect. Greek, which was originally spoken by a large segment of the Jews in Eretz Yisrael, becomes a hated language because of that. And therefore, why then do some historians say that they are two? Because we only know of one of them. They say the second one that people now use is not the original one, because that one has become tainted. And so from yeshivas, you will not find a copy of the Septuagint. It's not used. My only time I used it was in Durham University. Whether or not, and so I had a history professor who says it's a different one. It was written much later. According to others, it's the same one, but it was a lot of the Dead Sea Scrolls contain within them texts which fell by the wayside. But the text itself of the Sefer Torah always was maintained. At this point in our history, in the 6th, 7th century, Israel once again gains supremacy in it, and the Sefer Torah that Rambam uses nearly 800 or so years later, he traces back to the one that was written at this point in Israel, stored in Egypt, and all our Sefer Torah that we have now are based on what Rambam has done. Now, we've got 2 minutes left, and I just want to tell you something what I find fascinating. The word Yisrael is an abbreviation and an acronym of Yesh Shishim Ribi Osis Torah. There are 600,000 letters in the Torah. Now, if you count the letters in the Torah, you get to nowhere near 600,000. You're 387,000 or so. There are a number of different answers. My father's favorite one, which he always said to me, is that the space between the letters also counts, which is he calls it. So, and if, because in a Sefer Torah, if a letter is missing, it's possible. And if the space is missing, it's also possible. And also said to me, make sure to look out for the white letters with all the race. we know of the black letters, the loud ones. Do we recognize the white letters? Do we recognize the quiet ones? So that's one answer. The other answer is that we've had it in the Gemara Shabbos not so long ago about the earlier scholars who knew exactly how many letters there were in the Torah. And according to them, there were 600,000 letters. How did we lose half the letters? Because there weren't vowels. And if there are no vowels, then they use an extra aleph, a vav, or a yud in order to tell you how to read if you've only got the consonants. Once the voweling system was put in place, these superfluous letters weren't necessary, and the Torah was once again written with just the consonants, and you had to learn. You had your Tikkun Korim, which has your vowels written in, and you learned it there, and then read from the Sefer Torah without it. So the Sefer Torah that we have now has only got 387,564 there or thereabouts. I can't remember the exact number of letters. Earlier Sefer Torah may have had exactly 600,000. Nothing changed. Just, it's not even the pronunciation. The vowels at that point were inserted in the form of letters, were taken back out again once the vowels were more known.
Sorry, Rabbi,
Yes, Mark.
you're saying a similar way to the way Yiddish is written.
Yes, you could say it's similar to the way Yiddish is written. In Yiddish, if you want to go, you've got the ayin, two yods, the two. Yes, you could in a similar sort of way to which Yiddish is written. Yeah, but the one that we have now, based on Rambam, he traces back to written at this time, and he was done because of the calm that was put in Eretz Yisrael because of the Muslims. It was done for two reasons. One, they needed the Jews in order to maintain civil authority, and B, they still, even after Muhammad turned his back on the Jews, they still did need a link to the past. And that link to the past was within Judaism, and it also gave them somebody to fight up against later on with the with the Christians, as we'll learn next week when Islam now comes into Europe with the reconquest of Spain in the first half of the 8th century. Is anybody aware of the battle that they had in France?
Poitiers.
Sorry?
Poitiers.
Could be. Let's make sure we get the... So who beat them?
I thought the French, but that's probably the French history.
Yeah. Let's make sure we get the correct name of them. I do have them over here. The battle, yes. The Battle of Poitiers, Poitiers, Poitiers.
No, Poitiers.
Poitiers. Fine. In 732, they were beaten by Charles Martel. Otherwise, they would have gone on to conquer France. You know, they didn't do it in 732. Instead, they did it in about 2003. Islam has definitely conquered France.
Yeah.
Politically incorrect. I mustn't say that. Gentlemen, it's been lovely. Sorry, Ian.
Thank you very much indeed. My apologies for delayed arrival.
It's all right. The first half was all about Judaism. We haven't mentioned Islam in the first half, so it's all right.
Thank you.
The bit you love.
Peace of you.
Yeah, thank you, Rabbi.
Yeah, very, very.